What if everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages was a carefully curated illusion? What if the people we call peasants held secrets, not of ignorance, but of survival, mastery, and forbidden knowledge? What if the very fabric of their existence concealed a code, one that whispered of lost sciences, hidden rituals, and technologies history tried to erase? And what if the truth of those who work the soil is the key to understanding the great mystery of civilization itself? They called them peasants. A word that hangs heavy with disdain, echoing through the chambers of time like a verdict passed by those who wrote the chronicles. To us, they are figures in faded manuscripts, bent-backed, dirt-streaked, shackled to the earth. But step closer, much closer, and the illusion begins to fracture. Behind the soot and sweat, you will not find ignorance. You will find adaptation, resourcefulness, and an unspoken contract with forces most of us have long forgotten. The Middle Ages were not silent centuries. They pulsed with an intricate rhythm of survival and obligation, of rituals so deeply entwined with the natural world that they bordered on the arcane. These people, the so-called peasants, were not mere laborers. They were custodians of a knowledge so intimate, so elemental, that without it, the great cathedrals would never have risen, the feasts of kings would never have been served, and the empire of faith itself might never have endured. Consider their mastery of the soil. Barley, oats, peas, to the modern ear, a bland list of staples. To them, each was a sacred bargain struck with the seasons. A seed was not just a seed. It was a question whispered to the earth, will you give me life if I give you trust? They read the fields as one reads a manuscript, each furrow a line of script, each shadow of a passing cloud a word in the language of fate. And then, there is the plough. A simple instrument? Perhaps. Yet, in its iron curve lies an unbroken lineage stretching back to the dawn of agriculture. Imagine a man gripping its wooden frame, feeling the resistance of the earth as though the soil itself were alive. To plough was to negotiate, not to conquer. For they understood something we do not, that the land has memory. That every season, every cut of the blade into the dark soil, was an act witnessed by forces unseen. Some would say superstition. But what is superstition, if not the remnant of a science so ancient we can no longer name it? And when the harvest came, it was not simply toil rewarded. It was covenant fulfilled. Barley for bread, oats for beasts, peas for winter, but beneath the surface, these cycles spoke of a balance so delicate that to break it was to invite ruin. Today, we measure in bushels and tons, in yields and profits. They measured in omens. In the way a crow perched upon a fence at dusk. In the frost that came early, like a warning etched in silver across the fields. Animal husbandry, another phrase drained of wonder by the monotony of textbooks. But for the peasant, every beast was a fragment of the cosmic order. The ox was not just strength, it was patience incarnate. The sheep, docile yet vigilant, offered more than wool, it offered continuity in a world teetering on uncertainty. Cattle meant life, but also obligation, for in a society where famine lingered like a shadow at the door, to mismanage a herd was not mere negligence. It was sacrilege. We imagine them as solitary drudges, but the truth is more intricate. Theirs was a life of interdependence, communal labor, as much a survival tactic as a social bond. Roads were carved not by edicts from lords but by hands roughened by frost, working in unison. Fields were tilled in strips, parcelled out like notes in a symphony of labor. Every ploughman, every scythe-bearer, every woman binding sheaves was a note in that music, discord. And the village starved. Harmony, and life endured. But what fascinates most, what unsettles the neat margins of history, is the way their skills were fused with something that feels almost esoteric. Consider this, in a time before meteorology, how did they read the seasons with such precision? How did they sense, almost instinctively, the shift in wind that signaled a storm, the subtle pulse of the earth that spoke of drought? Was it mere observation honed to perfection, or something deeper? Some knowledge older than the church itself, passed down not in ink and vellum, but in whispers by the hearth? The land, to them, was alive. Not metaphorically, but viscerally alive. And to live upon it, to coax life from its depths, was to engage in a dialogue with that living force. So they cleared forests, yes, but always with ritual. They built homes, yes, but with timber aligned to the compass, as if to catch the breath of the four winds. Coincidence? Or the ghost of an ancient architecture of meaning, the remnants of a code that once governed all human interaction with the earth? Even their calendars, oh, how deceptively simple they appear. Days marked by saints and festivals, by sowing and harvest. But look closer, and you begin to see the bones of something older. Solstices and equinoxes hiding in plain sight. Pagan shadows flickering beneath the gaze of the cross. What we call the seasonal awareness may, in truth, have been the survival of an ancient astronomical intelligence, veiled, suppressed, yet indestructible. Dependability. The chronicles praise it as a virtue. But behind that word lies a truth both harsh and haunting: failure was fatal. To miss a harvest deadline, to falter in communal duty, these were not errors. They were invitations to death, delivered in the cold grip of famine. And so the peasant learned to be dependable, not as a moral choice, but as an existential imperative. And yet, their lives were not without creation. Even the poorest hands knew the language of wood and stone. A hut raised from timber, thatch woven against the bite of winter, these were acts of defiance against chaos. Roads laid by calloused palms were not mere pathways. They were arteries, binding together fragments of a world that might otherwise disintegrate. But here lies the enigma: these so-called simple skills, agriculture, animal care, communal labor, are often dismissed as primitive. Yet, in their quiet endurance, they carry a whisper of something far greater. A memory of the first civilizations, perhaps. A residue of techniques we do not fully understand. Ask yourself, how much of this knowledge was truly born in the Middle Ages, and how much was inherited from epochs buried under layers of sanctioned history? The Church kept its chronicles. The lords kept their ledgers. But the peasants, they kept something more elusive. A heritage of survival encoded not in parchment but in practice. A ritual geometry inscribed upon the land itself, visible only to those who knew how to read its signs. Was this mere necessity? Or was it, as some suspect, the last flicker of a forgotten science, the remnants of an age when human beings walked closer to the hidden laws of nature? What if the knowledge we dismiss as rustic labor was, in truth, the last ember of something luminous, something that once burned bright across a forgotten world? What if those bent figures in the fields were not the lowest rung of society, but the unknowing stewards of a code more ancient than any throne, any church, any kingdom carved in stone? When you follow the furrows of history deep enough, you begin to sense it, a hum beneath the noise of chronicles, a whisper stitched between the lines of official record. The Middle Ages, as we are taught, stand as an age of darkness, crude, illiterate, devout to the point of blindness. But peel away the gilded myths of progress and you uncover something unsettling. For in their daily toil, in the cyclical dance of soil and seed, the peasants preserved what empires could not. Think of their calendars again, not the neat parchment copies in a monastery scriptorium, but the living calendar etched in bone and breath. Days bound not to mechanical clocks, but to the solstice shadow sliding across a stone, to the angle of sunrise piercing the mist on a hill where no priest dared linger. The Church baptized these days with saints' names, draped them in holy vestments, but the skeleton beneath was older than Rome, older than Jerusalem. Samhain, Beltane, Imbolc, echoes of a cosmology that refused to die. And in the rhythm of planting and harvest, of fasting and feast, that pagan heartbeat pulsed on, camouflaged, but undefeated. Imagine a village at dusk. Smoke curling from thatched roofs, the air thick with the scent of earth and ash. At the edge of the fields, a ring of stones half buried in moss, their meaning long outlawed, their origin never spoken. Children play among them, unaware they are treading the geometry of an ancient power. The elders glance at those stones, their faces unreadable, and when the wind shifts, they mutter a charm against frost, a charm older than Latin, spoken in syllables worn smooth by centuries. Is this peasant superstition? Or the ghost of a science we have lost? Even their tools, the plough, the scythe, the flail, seem blunt and primitive, until you see them as relics of continuity. The iron share that cleaves the soil traces its lineage back to Sumer, to the Nile, to the Indus. It is not a mere implement. It is a cipher, carrying within its curve the entire history of humanity's pact with the earth. And the patterns of the fields, those long, narrow strips divided by hedgerows, seem accidental until you climb a hill and look down. Then you see the geometry. The lines do not lie. They speak of proportion, of order, a lattice inscribed upon the land like a manuscript in living green. Some archaeologists call it efficiency. Others suspect something stranger, a hidden code, perhaps astronomical, embedded in the very bones of the countryside. Could it be that what we call peasant skills, the sowing, the reaping, the tending of beasts, were once part of a larger knowledge system, now shattered and fragmented, like shards of a mirror scattered across the ages? A system that fused agriculture with astronomy, ritual with mathematics, survival with meaning? Look closer at animal husbandry. It seems practical: you meat, milk, wool. But dig deeper. Cattle were not just sustenance. They were currency, sacred objects, nodes in a network of power and sacrifice. Why did so many medieval villages mark midsummer by driving cattle between twin fires? The chroniclers dismiss it as quaint folk custom. But fire purifies. Fire seals the covenant. And the twin flames, what do they mirror? Twin stars? Twin pillars of some lost cosmology, preserved in smoke and superstition? And what of the herbs? Every hedge witch and midwife knew their secrets. Feverfew for the burning sickness. Yarrow to staunch the blood. But beneath the practical medicine lurked a map, a taxonomy of plants aligned not by random utility, but by correspondences, moon herbs, sun herbs, roots of Saturn, blossoms of Venus. A pattern drawn from the same well that fed the grimoires locked in cathedral libraries, grimoires that peasants would never see, yet somehow mirrored in their oral lore. Coincidence? Or proof that knowledge flows like water, seeping through the cracks no matter how high the walls built to contain it? Then there is the question no scholar wants to touch: where did this knowledge come from? Not the church, which spent centuries branding it as witchcraft. Not the nobles, who scoffed at the rustics even as they depended on them for survival. Could it be older than feudalism itself, older than the first crowned king? There are those who believe the answer lies in the ruins, in the megalithic stones, in the earthworks that ripple across the British Isles like frozen waves. Long before the plough scarred the land, before Latin sanctified it, there were people here, people who raised stone circles that charted the heavens with an accuracy modern science still marvels at. Their names are gone, their cities dust, yet their shadow lingers in the customs of those who tilled the medieval soil. You see it in their fear of thresholds, their offerings at wells, their reverence for the oak. These are not random superstitions. They are fragments of a cosmology shattered by conquest, scattered by time, but never erased. A seed of Atlantis in a furrow of Kent. A whisper of Hyperborea in the smoke of a Breton hearth. What if, just what if, the peasants were the last unwitting guardians of that inheritance? Consider this: the lords ruled with swords, the church with scripture. But the peasants ruled with continuity. Empires rose and fell. Dynasties crumbled like clay idols. Yet the hands that planted barley, that coaxed life from stubborn soil, endured. And through those hands flowed not just blood and sweat, but memory. Not in words, not in books, but in gestures, in rituals, in the way a field was turned to face the dawn, in the way a child was named at the threshold of a solstice. And then comes the speculation, the shadow where history trembles. What if those skills, the plowing, the planting, the herding, were encoded? What if each act was more than utility? What if every furrow traced on the earth was a line in an immense and invisible text, a text written not in ink, but in earth and bone, in blood and breath, a text whose author was a civilization so old its name has dissolved into myth? If that were true, if the peasant's toil was the final echo of a science now beyond our reach, then what else have we lost? What doors remain unopened because we mistook knowledge for ignorance, craft for chance, superstition for nonsense? The truth is this: history is not a ladder. It is a labyrinth. And the peasants, in their silence, may have held more keys than the crowned heads who strutted in ermine, than the bishops who thundered from pulpits. Perhaps they still do. For the land remembers. And in the folds of that memory, beneath the plough and the pasture, something waits. Something we were never meant to find. And if I told you that the very soil beneath your feet might hold not just bones and relics, but an entire system of meaning, an architecture of power mapped in geometry, in ley lines, in patterns only visible from the sky, would you call it madness? Or would you wonder, as I do, whether the peasant's humble world was never humble at all, but a mask, drawn over a truth that could shatter everything we think we know? We are close now, close to a revelation that has burned in whispers for centuries. But to see it clearly, we must descend deeper. Into the symbols etched upon medieval charms. Into the forbidden texts hidden in monastic vaults. Into the riddle of continuity itself, the thread that runs from the furrow to the cathedral, from the ox to the orrery, from the peasant's chant to the astronomer's chart. And the question that haunts me, that should haunt us all, is this: if they preserved what they did not fully understand, what was the source? Who lit the fire that smoulders still in the ashes of time? Imagine this: you stand in a medieval field at dawn, the horizon bleeding gold across furrows still wet with dew. The village sleeps behind you, a scatter of thatched roofs wrapped in mist. But here, in this silent geometry of soil and shadow, a truth stirs, one too vast to fit within the pages of any chronicle. For every line carved by the plough is not random, but deliberate, as if the earth itself were a manuscript, and those who tilled it, scribes of an older law. We have traced their rituals, their harvest dances, their solstice fires, back through time like threads of smoke. But where do they lead? To Rome? To Babylon? Or to something older still, something that crouches just beyond the reach of recorded memory, like a beast at the edge of firelight? Consider the architecture of the cathedrals. Spires that pierce the sky, vaults that bloom like frozen sound, miracles of stone, we are told, wrought by genius and faith. But look closely. Beneath the Gothic grandeur lies a pattern, a code of ratios that whispers of Egypt, of the stars, of a language carved not in words but in number. Could the peasants, those faceless figures we consign to mud and obscurity, have held fragments of this code? They never wrote treatises. They never drew blueprints. Yet without their hands, their timber, their stone, without the living knowledge of how to coax strength from soil, stability from mud, endurance from oak, these wonders would never have risen. But what if their contribution was more than muscle? What if their communal rituals, their alignment of fields, their careful keeping of the seasons were not mere practicality, but participation in something immense, a design so old it was no longer understood, only enacted? Like actors repeating lines in a play whose script has been burned, yet whose cadence endures in memory. Archaeologists now speak of cognitive residues, the ghostly persistence of patterns long after their meaning has been forgotten. Why do certain medieval villages cluster along invisible lines, only revealed today by aerial mapping? Why do wells and churches sit atop pagan springs, And why do those springs themselves align with lunar standstills, solar risings, constellations frozen in their eternal arcs? Is it accident? Or the stubborn survival of a worldview erased by conquest, masked by dogma, yet encoded in custom, of a worldview that saw no division between heaven and earth, between star and seed, between the breath of a beast and the breath of a god? If so, then every gesture of the peasant was an echo of a vanished civilization, a civilization that spoke in symbols, not syllables, that measured time not in hours, but in harmonies. And if that civilization left no ruins, no monuments, no libraries, perhaps it is because its temple was the earth itself. Its scripture, the furrow. Its priesthood, the humble. We may never recover its name, but we feel its pulse in the standing stones that shoulder the weight of forgotten skies, in the riddled geometry of the land, like veins beneath the skin of a continent, in the rituals that clung to life even as the pyres of heretics lit the night. And here is the question that chills me: what else did they know? What arts have we lost to the silence of centuries? Could their whispered charms against frost conceal principles of natural law now smothered beneath superstition? Could their lore of stars and seeds hint at a science of resonance, of fertility, of energy flowing between earth and sky, a science we dismiss as myth, because we cannot yet decipher its grammar? Perhaps the peasants themselves did not know. Perhaps they were merely the last custodians of a chain forged in an age before memory, a chain that snapped with the coming of enclosure, of mechanization, of the modern hunger for progress that devours all roots. When the commons fell, when the hedgerows were torn down, when the last rituals were mocked into silence, something far greater than custom died. A language without words, was lost. And yet, the ruins of that language still haunt the margins. In the names of fields. In the patterns of old paths that twist like serpents across the hills. In the forgotten tools rusting in a barn, their forms so elegant they seem to hum with purpose. We step over these fragments, blind and hurried. But if we could read them, if we could stitch together their broken syllables, what would they tell us? That civilization is not ascent but amnesia? That we are not the pinnacle of progress, but exiles wandering further and further from a center we can no longer even imagine? Ask yourself this: why do these remnants draw us? Why do we feel, in their presence, a nostalgia for something we have never known? Perhaps because some part of us remembers. Not in words, but in bone. In the primal ache that stirs when we hear wind comb through barley, when we see the curve of a scythe against the sun, when we smell earth newly turned, raw and damp and waiting. These are not accidents. These are messages. Messages written for those who still know how to listen. And the final question, the question that lingers like smoke long after the fire is gone, is this: what if the age we call medieval was not a dark age, but a twilight? The last dim glow before the night fell. And what if, in that twilight, the peasants carried torches whose light we have yet to understand? Perhaps the story of humanity is not the rise from ignorance to knowledge, but the fall from wonder into certainty. And if that is true, then the humblest hands may have held the greatest secret of all. So the next time you pass a field, or touch the grain of old timber, or stand among stones whose builders are dust, pause. Listen. For the earth remembers. And sometimes, if the wind is right, it speaks. If this opened your eyes, share it with someone who questions history. Subscribe for the next revelation, and comment your thoughts. The conversation isn't over.